Hello and welcome to Property Question Time. I'm Stephen Galpin and this is the show where you can have all of your property related questions answered by our team of property experts. Joining me today is somebody who's a property developer, investor and co-founder of Your Freedom Empire. Hayley Andrews, welcome Hayley.
Thank you for having me.
First time on Question Time?
Absolutely.
Well, John doesn't bite, so you'll be quite safe. Had a good trip down from Birmingham?
Very much so, yeah.
Good. Okay, well, very good to see you here. And joining us again is John Howard, one of our elite property experts, property developer, author, public speaker, mentor, and lots of other things too. Welcome, John.
Thank you very much, and it's good to be back as always to see you, Stephen.
Good. Okay, well, we've got 4 very good questions today. So, Hayley, I'm going to start with you. And this is a subject that I think affects us all through our ownership times in property. But anyway, I've just had a firm offer on a property I'm selling, but the buyers had a mortgage valuation done by a firm of surveyors appointed by their building society. The valuation came in 10% less than the agreed selling price, and they're now suggesting that I accept a 10% discount on the price. My understanding that this type of valuation will always be a bit less than the agreed selling price. So, should I accept the request for a discount? Both the buyer and my agent are pushing me to agree it. Well, wouldn't they just, with fees involved? But there we are. Hayley.
So firstly, I would say it's very much what do you want to happen? In accepting a lower sale price, how does that affect you? Don't be pushed into making a decision. You very much have to think about that. Your understanding is not politically correct in terms of the valuation. It would be carried out on the day and would be valued accordingly based off what valuation has been instructed to be carried out. So there's a number of things that you can do. You can firstly stand ground. We are in the strongest sellers market in a decade. There is a lack of supply of properties coming to the market and a sheer growth of demand. So you are in a strong position to put the property back to the market and sell that property, or stand ground and say the price is the price, that is what I will accept. You either move forward with the purchase or not. Secondly, you can negotiate. You can speak to the estate agent and the vendor and create a win-win situation and perhaps meet somewhere in the middle where the purchaser will have to make up the additional shortfall from the lending side. And thirdly, you can accept the 10%. So that's very much the things that you would be able to move forward with. It is, how does it affect you? What does taking a discount mean? And are you prepared to lose that purchaser and put the property back to the market?
I think it's a very difficult thing, isn't it, for anybody to value a property almost within 10%. It's quite a hard science, if that's what it is.
Stephen, I agree entirely with you. It's personal opinion. You get two agents or 3 agents will look at the property and say, oh well, one might say it's worth 400, another 450, one 500. Who's right? It's very difficult.
I think you have to look at the motivation here. An agent will be trying to get instructions, so he will always tell you what you want to hear.
You want to hear.
Yeah,
sure.
Exactly.
I think a surveyor, when he comes, I'm a little bit anti these desktop valuations because 2 things. I think one, if you want to argue it, it's already all over the internet what you've been valued at, so you've got a real uphill struggle there. It's on all the databases. And I do think where the big lenders have used valuers who have done cut price valuations, the sort of £100–150 thing, when you and I know, John, that in the past a valuation could cost you £1,000.
It still does on the development, doesn't it? I mean, if you're doing one of your developments, you're not getting it done for 150 quid. It's probably 2,000 or 3,000. So
I think what the sort of cheaper end of the valuations tend to do is undervalue so that they don't go anywhere near their public liability insurance.
Some now do drive-bys.
Yeah.
Actually they were doing drive-bys 2008, 2009. All of a sudden they got the valuations wrong, so they've been a bit nervous about it till now. But I've noticed more doing drive-bys, and also more are doing it on desktop, because if you're only borrowing 60% or 70%, does it really matter if the valuation's slightly out? It doesn't really matter. It only matters when it's 90–95% in my view.
I think there's a couple of things on this question. I think the last sentence says quite a lot. Both the buyer and my agent are pushing me to agree. Well, why wouldn't they? You know, the agent's in for fees and the buyer wants the best possible price. But I think Hayley's point is right. We're in a pretty bullish market at the moment.
Hayley's absolutely right. But also the agent is meant to be working
On behalf
for
of
their
the
client.
seller.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, there we are. Complex subject, but I think, John, you're like me, you spent many, many years arguing with valuers, and it's probably never going to change, is it?
No, I mean, as we said before, John, I've never been able to overturn it or get it amended. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are right, but as you said, it's subjective to the day that...
The one thing you've got to hope it's not the same value that comes back the second time.
Yes.
So then you reset it. Otherwise you are in trouble.
Absolutely,
Third time lucky.
Yeah, well, it's always worth a few chips. Anyway, right, John, your first question. Yes. I reserved and subsequently exchanged contracts on an off-plan apartment. The property is taking much longer than I anticipated to be completed, and the developers say that the contract does not stipulate a long stop date for completion. Do I have any rights in this situation, and is there a reasonable time in that the completion should be made? I guess that any legal action would in any event probably take longer than waiting for the completion to happen. So a bit of a catch-22 there, I suppose.
Well, I think the first thing, Stephen, is it going to be completed? Is there a reason why it's not completed within a certain amount of time? Most of these contracts on this new build will say if it's not built within, say, 2.5 years, then you get your money back. And if your solicitor hasn't put that in the contract, you can probably sue your solicitor, but that's always difficult. But I mean, I would have said, and it also depends if they still want it or not, because it's a great way of getting out of it. If it's 2.5 years, say, I know it isn't in this case, but if it was, and you decided after over 2.5 years they still hadn't done it, you've got the option to pull out and get your deposit back, then you might decide you want to do that. However, in this case, it's so important that you have a backstop date because it concentrates the mind of the developer. If I'm the developer, or Hayley's the developer, and you've only got a year and a half to finish it, you're going to make sure it's finished in a year and a half. Otherwise, all your sales are finished, and so's the bank going to be on you as well. So you must have a backstop date.
I think what I do quite like to see in a contract is sort of project stages, really, so that by a certain date the developer's up to...
It's called a hurdle, isn't it, these days? This very trendy court name. I think it's called a hurdle.
Is it really?
Yeah, hurdle.
Okay. I'll be guided by you,
There's
Tom.
3 or 4 different hurdles, so, you know, getting planning permission, start date, first fixed date, second fixed date, completion date.
But I think it's also quite important, you know, a lot of this does relate, as you quite rightly point out, at the solicitor's door, because it's him that's going to provide, or her provide you with a sort of report on title, which should take you through the contractual stages. And it's quite important, I always think, if you're in London, you're dealing with leasehold properties, high-rise buildings, then get a solicitor that understands that market.
There, please,
you know?
as it's my question.
Go on then.
There are high-rise blocks outside London.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, I never knew that. Did you know that, Hayley?
Lots in Birmingham.
In Birmingham, yeah. No, but seriously, I think it's very important to have a solicitor that understands what you're buying. Yeah. You know, because buying on a housing estate is totally different from buying in a high rise or
leasehold, service charges, everything else that comes into it. Yeah,
it's very important. Now, look, just before we go to the break, we have a couple of minutes, and I just want to ask you both something. You're both involved in property development now. 3 or 4 years ago, we had the dreadful Grenfell disaster, which alerted us to really shoddy refurbishment, I suppose, in effect, or certainly without the control of building regulations that should have been, or control of product that perhaps should have been looked at more closely. Probably. And just over a week ago, we had a very bad fire here in East London on one of the blocks, not a few hundred yards from here. And because of that, there's been some demonstrating about why haven't these matters been progressed in the 4 years? That's one question, and one can only assume it's the finances of the developer. I mean, that's an obvious assumption. But more importantly, people are pushing now to have legislation that would perhaps preclude a developer from starting or progressing any new project until his old projects were safe and correct. What do you think to that? Hayley, what do you think?
I don't know. I mean, obviously that will it will stop people from moving forward and slow down development, and that's not what we want to happen. So I think it's kind of a very thin line that has to be trodden here, and it has to kind of be on both sides. We obviously want developers to move forward, and we want to encourage development because there's a huge lack of housing here in the UK. But we also need to make sure that the developments that they already own are up to standard.
I'm worried about this whole thing. I see a number of people, some developers, making a bit of a career out of all this. I don't want to sort of reduce the seriousness or consequences of Grenfell and the onward traction from there. But, you know, I see things being done in buildings which are really not really necessary.
But Stephen, there's two different things here. There's Grenfell where they put the wrong cladding on, and how the local authority didn't check that correctly.
Well, this one had the same here.
And why the fire officer didn't check it as well every year, I don't know. And then there's the developments that have been done correctly for their time. You know, 10, 15 years ago, they were correct. One thing that a lot of the blocks are absolutely fine with the cladding, but at every level you need a fire break now, and those fire breaks sometimes weren't put in because they didn't need to be put in. Now they've got to be put in, and that's expensive because although it's not a massive job to do, it's the scaffolding that's costs the money. With our block in Ipswich, for instance, you know, non-combustible cladding, it was all done correctly and properly. But I know there are a number of blocks, especially in London, of course, where they're not mortgageable at the moment, and anyone looking to buy one of these as an investment must be very careful because you've got to add on to whatever cost it's going to be to put it right. Now, it may be a really good deal. You might be able to buy one very cheap because of these problems, and by adding the money required to refurbish it and sort out the cladding, it still might be very cheap when it's all completed. Okay. So I don't think we want to be too negative about it. I do understand there are problems. The government are in a right mess with it. A number of MPs have decided to vote against the government with regards to the support they're giving to the cladding. Anybody with cladding over 5 stories gets all their money, get it all paid for, but under you don't. And for things like fire breaks at each level, you're not getting any paid out for that either. So it's difficult.
Okay, John, thank you very much. Hayley, thank you. That's all we've got time for in this half of the show. Join me again after the break. Hello and welcome back to part 2 of Property Question Time. I'm Stephen Galpin. I'm joined today by Hayley Andrews and John Howard. Welcome back, both of you. Hayley, your second question. When buying a property from auction, what would happen if I found after the purchase that some of the seller's pack information was proven wrong? Would I have the opportunity of undoing the transaction?
So it is buyers beware. So it's up to you as the buyer to identify any issues with that purchase in the form of downloading the legal pack, making sure you have a solicitor read through that legal pack, having any searches that they advise you to have, and a survey. So it would very much depend on the severity of the case. If the legal pack was incorrect or misleading, then you may have a case to withdraw, but it again, as I said, it will very much depend on the severity of the case. For example, if the property is listed as vacant possession and then you exchange and legally commit yourself to that asset or that investment, and then you find out that there is a tenant in situ, that is a clear breach, and you may have a case then to withdraw without forfeiting the deposit.
Yeah, you definitely have a good case on that one.
Yeah.
Who's the case against? Is it the auction house? Is it the vendor?
It would be the solicitor that drew up the legal pack, wouldn't it?
Yes, probably. I mean, obviously, you know, I was involved with Auction House for 10, 12 years as a major shareholder. I mean, what I would say is that the auctioneer, if you look at the bottom of everything it says, disclaimer. Now, that disclaimer is worth something, but ultimately, you would probably sue the auction house, and they would probably then counter-sue the owner. I would imagine that's the way it would work.
Do you not think, John, if you came
very rare, by the way, very rare.
If you came up with some some issue, and well, as you both said, if it was relatively serious. I just have a feeling, I doubt if the auction house would pursue you for completion anyway, would they?
Well, in my experience of running these businesses, very rarely, because they don't want, at the end of the day, they don't want any hassle, and they would probably advise the vendor to hand the money back. Of course, the money might still be with the auctioneer, because don't forget, you pay the auctioneer the 10%. And they then send it over to the vendor solicitor. But if there's a big breach like that, I think it's pretty obvious that you don't buy it. Now, sometimes having a problem is good.
Yeah.
It's not always bad, because you could get a delay completion until the property is vacant, for instance.
Yeah.
So in which time you could sell it on or do all sorts of different things. So it's not always a problem. Sometimes the biggest thing with auctions is you need to know what the problem is. Once you know what the problem is, why the property's in the auction, then you can deal with it accordingly.
Yeah. But an auction is based on trust, really, isn't it? A lot of the transaction is something on trust, that you've read your articles properly, you've done your due diligence, and that the auctioneers are being truthful.
I'm sure Hayley has the same thing. She advice from people ring up and say, "Oh, I've gone and bought a property at auction. I didn't mean to buy it. I got a bit excited." I mean, goodness me, that's the last thing you should do, Hayley, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And we see it a lot with amateurs, especially now, because with auction, a lot of people go into auction not really knowing how to purchase in auction, and understanding, of course, what they're buying. Some people don't even view the properties.
It's absolute madness. Three things are really, really important. One, view the property.
Yeah.
2, make sure you got the finance organised prior to purchase. And 3, make sure a solicitor has read the legal pack. Very important.
Hayley, part of your business, well, a significant part of your business is mentoring people at sort of all ends of the property scale. Would you advise somebody who's fairly new to the property business to buy at auction?
It really depends on their risk profile, and the funds that they have available, of course, as well. I would say that we would go through all of the steps that John spoke about. We'd add a few additional in there to make sure that they're minimising their risk as much as possible. Auction, of course, can get quite exciting. You've got to understand what you're paying for that property. You need to do the correct due diligence. You need to make sure you're understanding everything about that investment before you purchase. And of course, it's a much quicker process. So it's a great place to, build your portfolio quicker, but with that comes risk. So as long as you understand that risk before moving into purchasing in auction, then I would say, yes, that's fine. If you are just going to auction with zero idea of what you're doing and you haven't done the correct due diligence, then I'd say stay away.
I think one of the, Hayley, we do hope you come back to us again on property question time. We don't frighten you off too harshly, but John and I have heard many times and realised and both advised the importance of having your team around you when you're starting on the sort of property development side of things, especially. And I guess with auction, once the hammer's gone down, if you haven't got that team already in place, you must feel really on your own.
It's not for the faint-hearted. However, sorry,
I was just going to say it's a great place to buy and sell property, and it is exciting and it's much quicker, a much quicker process. So the attraction obviously is there, but you just need to be careful in moving forward with that type of purchase. Like John said, make sure you've got the funds available, make sure you tap into your team.
I mean, the last 3 deals I've done this year so far have been all buying after the auction, because that's a whole nother story.
Yeah.
But that's where the bargains are.
Yes.
After the auction.
Yes. I also tend to agree with you. That a problem is not necessarily a problem. It can be turned to advantage quite
if you can
easily.
Solve problems, you can make money.
Developing is all about solving problems, really. Other people's problems.
I've got property developers friends that won't buy unless there's a problem.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Well, that's probably the same for most of us when you think about when you analyse it. It's probably the same for most of us. If there's no problem, it's probably not a bargain.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, Hayley. John, I'm new to the world of property development and I'm considering starting a small project which will produce approximately 20 flats. I have full planning consent and I'm just waiting for the right time to start. Do the experts feel that I would be better sourcing various contractors and supervising them myself, or put the work out to tender and effectively enter into a turnkey operation?
This has got all the makings of a disaster, Stephen.
Right, okay.
That's the first thing. First of all, building 20 flats is a big scheme. You know, something that Hayley would do, something that I would do. But it's big, you know, it's not for the faint-hearted. And depending on what experience they've got, I mean, obviously if they've got qualifications in building or something like that, I'm assuming they haven't, but from what they've said. So let's assume they're novice to it, okay? The very last thing you want to do is try and do it on the cheap and get a builder in, you know, to do some of the work, a plumber, you know, put all the trades in. So please don't do that. Find yourself a really good building surveyor, get a schedule of works done, go out to tender on that schedule of works, so everyone's quoting on the same basis, and then get that building surveyor to advise you and oversee the project all the way through, pick the right developer, pick the right builder, not necessarily the cheapest one, because you've got to ask why is it that cheap if one's a lot cheaper than the other. I have a rule. Every builder we use, or contractor, because once they get over a certain level, if you call them builders, they get the hump. They like to be called contractors. So every contractor we use...
I think they all ought to be buried behind walls at Burn.
Well, there you go. There's been a few things buried behind walls over the years, I'm sure. What's really, really important is that you make sure that they have a good turnover of business. So if you're spending £1 million with them, I like them to have a 4 million turnover, so that mine is not the only job they're relying on. Because if they make a mistake on my job and that's the only job they've got, they won't be able to finish it, they'll go bust. If they've got 3 or 4 jobs on the go and they're making good money on the other jobs, they can subsidise that job a little bit if they made a mistake on mine. So I want a contractor to be able to have, you know, my job only wants to be a quarter of their turnover, ideally. Oversee the project with the building surveyor, get involved with them, learn from the building surveyor. But, you know, I've been at it 40 years. Hayley's been at it longer than she looks, to be fair.
19.
19 years. I can't believe that, Hayley. And you know, you never stop learning. And I always have a building surveyor, and I've just employed a full-time one, by the way. Always have a building surveyor to oversee every project we do. And if I'm doing that and Hayley's doing that, then guess what? They should be doing that as well.
And mistakes are still made.
For sure, and the mistakes can still be made.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And I suppose the other obvious thing to say is it's a good idea to go and see something that he's already built.
That does help. Yeah, absolutely. And more importantly, talk to the client who employed them.
Yeah.
Really important.
Yeah. Okay, well, just in the last minute or two of the show, I just want to go back to what we were talking about earlier, which is this rectification works of perhaps dangerous buildings. Yes. What's going to happen, John? I can quite see the situation where developers have held on to the freehold of their portfolio, start to get in financial trouble here. I know, for instance, the quote for doing some building works on a building not far from here, the rectification works around about £12 million. Now, if the government do legislate and really do make it impossible for the developers to claw this back under the sort of freehold structure, this is going to make an awful big hole in their balance sheets, isn't it?
Well, I mean,
and what's going to happen then?
Okay, well, some of the big builders, I mean, the ones quote on the stock market, they have already said they're going to go back and sort things out on some of these blocks.
Taylor Wimpey has said they'll do it without cost to the tenants.
And to be fair to them, that's very good of them, because legally they don't need to, because they did them correctly in the first place. So I think good for them. It helps all of us if they do that. But is it really fair for a developer who did nothing wrong in the first place to have to go back and put their own money into repairing or improving the fire resistance or whatever on a block that was done 20 years ago, because they did it all correctly 20 years ago? So it's a very difficult situation. The leaseholder is right, the freeholder probably is right, the government is probably right. You know, it's very, very difficult. It's a really difficult situation, and the government have not got a handle on it. They have not got a handle on it properly.
last word to the lady on the show.
Yeah, like I said earlier, it's a thin line, and obviously it has to be a win-win situation for everyone. It's not fair. Everybody can say it's not fair, can't they? And that's the problem.
I really am worried about where the buck stops with
I
this.
agree.
You
I
can
agree
even go.
entirely.
You can even go back to the council that authorised the.
Absolutely,
the works,
you can.
know.
Yeah.
Anyway, look, there we are. Thank you both very much indeed. Hayley Andrews, thank you very much for coming down from Birmingham to be on the show. Thank you.
Pleasure.
John Howard, thank you for coming.
Always a pleasure, Stephen.
All the way from Ipswich.
It's always a pleasure.
I'm still not sure where it is. But
Well, we are going to have dinner there at some time.
Okay.
Because things open up soon, so
Okay,
I'm inviting you
well,
down.
that's a publicly made promise.
It is.
Now, so there we are. Okay, well, there we are. I'm Stephen Galpin. Thank you very much for joining us on Property Question Time. See you next time.